The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, provides countries with loans to secure financial stability. However, in Ukraine, which has had several loans of the IMF, this promise of financial stability hasn't been realized. Welcome to the involvement of the IMF in the war in Ukraine and some other things. So what is the IMF exactly? Created in 1945, the IMF is governed by the countries that make up its near global membership. Its original aims are promote international monetary cooperation, facilitate the expansion of international trade, promote exchange stability, assist in the establishing of payment systems, and make resources available to member countries experiencing payment difficulties. The IMF is an organization of 189 countries, which all pay a percentage of their GDP to the IMF. The more you pay, the more influence you have. The IMF in turn provides loans to member countries experiencing actual or potential payment problems. The IMF's resources are made available under a lending arrangement, which may specify the economic policies and measures a country has to implement to resolve payment problems. This means that the IMF can specify what economic policies countries have to implement. This is a breach in the Treaty of Westphalia, since it stated no interference in another country's domestic affairs. But in order to get help from the IMF, you have to accept this sovereignty infringement. But why did Ukraine need help from the IMF in the first place? In order to answer that, we have to go back to the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Iron Curtain falls. The Soviet Union breaks up into a lot of different new states. And so, Russia and Ukraine are born. Ukrainian economy suffered heavily from the fall of the Soviet Union, and this was mainly caused by hyperinflation, the decline of export, since the main export country was Russia, but Russia's economy was also very bad, the lack of access to financial markets, Ukraine couldn't get foreign investments to get their economy started, and the privatization of state-owned companies, which created a few very rich and corrupt oligarchs. And because of their new independence, there were massive costs to pay for the new government. This without help of the former Soviet Union to fund their government. This period of recession lasted until 2001, when the country was starting to do a bit better as a result of economic growth, which was partly because there was a money injection by the IMF. In 2004, the Orange Revolution took place. The people of Ukraine wanted the Ukrainian government to be more like Western European countries, with less corruption, and they felt that the rich oligarchs led the country in such a way that the average citizen didn't benefit from any of the economy restoration. This meant a break with Russia, and led to a significant drop in the economy of the Ukraine, because the Ukrainian economy was very interwoven with the Russian economy. In 2005, Ukraine needed help to get its economy running again, and so it got a $16.6 billion loan to improve its economy. This IMF aid package didn't really help the Ukrainian economy to work, because the still ongoing effects of the economic decline caused by the Orange Revolution. In 2008, the worldwide banking crisis happened, and the economy of Ukraine completely collapsed. In 2 years, the GDP dropped by 15%, and in 2010, Ukraine called for help by the IMF. They got a loan of $15.15 billion. The Ukrainian government hopes by having this IMF deal that the European market will be open for them, and this would help them to fix their economy. However, each loan of the IMF has its own reforms. The economy got even slowed down by this last deal. The reforms made to the Ukrainian economy included the gas subsidies for citizens were reduced by 50%, pension cuts, and no raising of the minimum wages. This meant that gas prices were rising for all Ukrainian households, and this meant that the flow of money that was otherwise directed back to the Ukrainian economy by normal consumption was now lowered because the Ukrainian people couldn't afford the same kind of consumption with the raised gas prices. This led to an even weaker economy and even less money to spend. In 2013, Ukraine was at the verge of being bankrupt. Since this was not an option, they went to the IMF again for a new loan. They got another bailout offer of $20 billion, bringing the total debt to more than $50 billion. The reforms needed for this loan were immense. There needed to be another 50% reduction on the subsidies for household gas, cuts to the pension, cuts to the government employment, and the privatization of a lot of government assets and property. Also, the IMF demanded that Ukraine should sign the association agreement with the European Union to apply for this new loan. The treaty contains stuff about trade, reform of policies, and reforms of the military. The European Association Treaty would open up the market for Western multinationals, and in theory, the European market would also be opened for Ukrainians. This association agreement did, however, force Ukrainians away from Russia, their most important trade partner. Next to that, this treaty still did not make it an equal playing field between Ukraine and the EU. The Ukraine wasn't allowed to freely sell all its products on the European market, while the EU member states were allowed to sell all their stuff in Ukraine. The treaty also meant opening up the market for foreign agricultural companies. The Ukrainian government needed to change policies regarding genetic modified food, also called GMOs. GMOs were always forbidden in Ukraine, just like the rest of Europe. But because of the lobby of big agricultural corporations like Monsanto, DuPont, and Cargill, this needed to change. The big corporations saw huge potential in the vast amounts of fertile soil Ukraine was rich of. And because of the trade clause in the treaty, the GMOs could be sold in the rest of the European member states. The treaty furthermore stated that the Ukrainian government would need to reform its military to NATO standards. This treaty would be the first step to a membership of NATO. The Ukrainian government of Yanukovych understood that this new IMF loan would do more harm than good to its economy. And this is where Russia comes into view. The Russians, seeing that the demand asked from the IMF would lead to the loss of influence in Ukraine, offered Ukraine $15 billion. However, if Ukraine wanted the $15 billion loan of Russia, they needed to freeze the relationship with the European Union and NATO. Yanukovych liked this deal, since it didn't have the harmful reforms like the IMF loan. So the strict reforms and the demands by the IMF drove the Ukrainian politicians towards a Russian alternative. A big part of the Ukrainians didn't like the choice that was made by Yanukovych to go back towards Russia. Since the Orange Revolution, they had tried to get their economy more and more in line with the Western economies of the EU, and already had made a lot of sacrifices to get there. The rejection of the EU Association Treaty in combination with this new alignment with Russia made them feel unheard. Furthermore, the population, dissatisfied because of the weak economy, feared for more corruption when doing business with the Russians. This led to the Maidan Revolution, which overthrew the government and replaced them with EU-minded politicians. But pro-Russian voters in the East felt crossed, and that their country wasn't taking a course they supported. Being pro-Russia in the east of Ukraine isn't strange, since a lot of people speak Russian and even identify culturally with Russia, especially in Crimea, which was Russian until 1954. In Crimea, a referendum was held to determine whether they should join the Russian Federation. 96% of voters chose to join the Russian Federation with a turnout rate of 83%, and on the 18th of March 2014 it was annexed by Russia. Spurred by this success, Donetsk and Luhansk also protested for independence, which caused Ukraine in March 2014 to send in troops to protect its territory and restore order to the region. So due to new, constricting IMF policies Ukraine had to implement, people became unhappy with their current situation. When politicians then tried to take an alternative offer by Russia, this led to revolution, separatists, and war in eastern Ukraine. The corrupt politicians against which the people at Maidan Square protested are now replaced with European-minded oligarchs, which are also deemed corrupt. In the meantime, the IMF loan, which was eventually accepted by the new government, doesn't seem to be doing Ukraine much good. A new loan is in the works.
If you like more of these kind of videos, like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.